It's time for another Out of Bounds Rewind with Bo Bounds on ESPN 105.9, The Zone.
Well, we appreciate your time today. I know it's been a tough week, but we wanted you to come on and share some stories. When was the first time you met the Pirate, Coach Mike Leach, Charlie?
Standing outside a bicycle shop in Key West, Florida. It was, I still laugh. We had flown down during the interview process, and I was with John Cohen, and we were at the Half Shell Oyster Bar and didn't tell Mike we were coming. And this is about 2 blocks from his house. And John had him on speaker, and he calls him. Keep in mind, it's closing in on noon, so Mike's still asleep, right? And John calls, and he says, "Hey, Mike, John Cohen wanted to know if you had some time to talk today." He's like, "Sure." He said, "Well, where are you guys today?" He said, "Well, we're 2 blocks from your house." And there was this long pause, and then just, "Well, go Bulldogs." And that was the first time I'd heard Mike Leach in a conversation directly. And so he said, "Hey, we want to meet up with you." So he meets us at a bicycle shop, and he looked directly out of central casting for what you'd expect Mike Leach. He had his cargo shorts, carrying a cup of coffee, a wrinkled black shirt, and we sat around his pool for basically 3 days, trying to talk football, but with Mike, we talked about everything else.
That is incredible. All right, so as you get into the you don't have to, some of the details you can't tell us, but as you get into the conversations, even Cohen shared with us, Charlie, about him reading you're a Mississippi State baseball fan and historian too for the last 40 years. He mentioned Ron Polk. He mentioned Ron Polk's book. Share some of those conversations down in Key West.
Some of my favorites actually related to baseball. We were sitting there, and of course he was fascinated by the fact that I was a lawyer and he had been to law school, so he wanted to talk about law school classes. And one of his stories they kept asking about, he said, "Were you ever the flagpole guy?" And I was like, "Well, the what?" So, and you took contracts. I was like, "Yeah." And he said, every day for me in law school, I would walk in and be, "Mr. Leach, if I told you that I'd give you $100 to climb that flagpole, and you climb it and you're 2 feet from the top, and I say deal's off, what do I owe you?" And then he said every day they'd have a different variable on the flagpole. What if you got to the top and you were on your way down, and then I said deal's off? And so for the next 3 days, periodically, I would get a flagpole quiz of, "So what do you think? What if you were almost there? What if you were within inches, but you hadn't touched it?" So I felt like I was in law school again because I was being quizzed about the flagpole. The baseball thing, he figured out that I coached Will Rogers, who he had offered at Washington State as a quarterback. Right. And Will played center field on our baseball team for about 7-8 years. And he, just in mid-sentence, he is talking about something, mesh routes and all this stuff, and he looks at me and says, "Hey, did he ever pitch?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, he primarily played center field, but he pitched some. He's, "What does motion look like?" And the thing you'd have to know about Will back at the time, at 12 years old, he had learned his pitching motion from a grandfather, and it looks like something out of the 1940s. It's the big, long, looping pitching motion, and that was the very first time that I ever heard Mike Leach say, "Well, that's utterly outstanding." And because utterly outstanding became, was one of his favorite things to say. "Well, that's outstanding." But then I got quizzed. Well, did he throw strikes? Did he hit guys? What was his ERA? But the thing he never asked, he was like, "I don't care how many hits he gave up. I just want to know if he threw strikes." And I was like, "Well, this was 12, 13. He's like, "Yeah, but if you can't throw strikes when you're 11, you can't throw strikes when you're 19. And so that was it was nonstop with wanting to know about Will Rogers as a baseball player.
Oh, Charlie Winfield sharing stories on the late Mike Leach on the Out of Bounds show. What was his? I'm sure you had this picture of his house as y'all met at the bicycle shop, and as you walked back. Was it in Key West? Was it what you thought it would be, or different?
Yeah, I think the thing that really hit me about Mike, and this I suppose I have learned about him over the years, is that he cared not one bit about pretense.
Mm-hmm.
He was obviously having a Key West house. A Key West house is a nice thing, but it wasn't. There was nothing about him that was designed to try to impress other people. It was all very nice. The house was great, but it wasn't. There was no showiness to it, and that was the thing about Mike Leach. I got to tell you this, folks. I thought of it this morning. We walked. He wanted to show us around the neighborhood, and so we were walking out the front door, and he had a neighbor who was an antiques dealer, and he had a brass cannon in his front yard, and not the complete cannon, but the barrel of the cannon. And Mike stops dead in his tracks, and he just looks at us. That's a cannon. And then for the next 10 minutes, he proceeds to think about what he would have to do to get a cannon, and then what sort of licensing do you need for a cannon? Is it a firearm? What if it doesn't have a fuse? You can't conceal it. And so, but what if you can't carry it? Does that make it a fire? So we had a 10-minute discussion about whether you needed a license to own a cannon within the state of Florida. And that's just how his mind was.
Charlie Winfield on the Out of Bounds show. So at what did y'all break bread? I mean, at what point did you go to lunch or dinner during this 3-day meet and greet as John Cohen and you and the team are trying to figure out if this is the next guy to lead Hail State football?
No, we basically just sat around his back porch. We went down for an afternoon, left, and then we came back and within a day or two, and that's when we spent 2 days. But it was basically sitting by his pool, drinking coffee, and listening to Mike Leach be Mike Leach. And it was one of those things that I felt like the entire time there must be like a 60 Minutes camera on us, because it just seemed, you just kind of had to shake yourself like, man, this is Mike Leach. Because you've heard all these stories about him, but what you found out is the guy was brilliant. But the thing that really jumped out at me the entire time, and Blake, I heard you say this earlier, we're talking about to be interesting, you have to be interested. The number of questions that he asked, even about me, I was just a lawyer there to help draft contracts, right? And the entire time, he wants to know about me. How many kids do you have? What position did your kid play? And, what's your approach? How many days a week did you practice? What was your practice schedule like? Did you have a formal practice schedule or just get out there? And I thought, this guy asking all these questions to figure out how I work was probably one of the things. I thought he was interested, he was inquisitive, and it was phenomenal. I'll tell you the one other thing I really jumps out is I wanted to be nice because Mike Leach lived like a vampire lifestyle, right? I mean, he got going as the sun was coming down, and he was one of these guys that stayed up all night. And I didn't want to say to him, "Hey, do you ever come to work?" But so I was trying to find like a nice way to ask it. And I was like, "So what's a typical day look like?" And he says, well, and he goes, and John Cohen's about to stare a hole through me for asking the bad question. and after about 20 minutes, he looks kind of up in the air and goes, so that's Monday. On Tuesday, we were like, no. But he talks about his things. Everything he said he was going to do, he did. He would, on Fridays, they'd always go to the movies. And that was the big thing is, he'd always – early in the week, he was already trying to figure out what was going to be on at the movies. They'd have walkthroughs in the parking lots before the games, before they ever left the hotel. He had all these little quirks about him that were just great.
Don't miss one moment of the Out of Bounds Show with Bo Bounds. Weekdays, 7 a.m. till 10 a.m. on ESPN 105.9. The Zone.